Hi, this is Publicity and Common Commitment to Believe, and my name is Robert Williams from the University of Leeds. I'm funded by the European Research Council on a project called Group Thinking New Foundations. I want to thank my funders. I also should thank Harvey Liederman, conversations with whom led to the content of this talk. Okay, so let me start by introducing the notion of public information. So perhaps easiest to start with just a paradigm. So in the days when we were allowed to meet up with each other, there were these things, teachers, lecturers, announcing facts to a class. So they may be saying London is the capital of the UK. Once they've made that assertion, it becomes part of the public record, part of the information available to that whole class, that London is indeed the capital of the UK. So we've got these public announcements, other kinds of events that are intuitively public amongst us. The literature contains analyses of what it is for a proposition to be public. Lots of these have variants of the common knowledge tradition. So just as a reminder, something is common knowledge when everyone knows it, everyone knows everybody knows it, everyone knows everybody knows it, and so on and so forth forever. The literature also contains many worries about how publicity, at least especially when it's analysed in that way, could in principle be achieved. How do we get to know all this kind of infinite stack of attitudes that our group members have? And publicity is widely put to work in the literature in various accounts of social phenomenon, from joint commitment in the work of Margaret Gilbert to Bratman on joint attention. You'll find it in Lewis famously in his work on social conventions. It's present throughout Stornaker's work on the dynamics of conversations. And my starting worry is that, although I appreciate that this looks like an important notion and it looks like we have some kind of interesting work on fighting back and forth on the details of the analysis, it's not clear to me at all what motivates the analyses of publicity that have been offered, these common knowledge shaped ones. And it's not clear to me what good being public is, what it brings to the party, which explains why it's so attractive to keep putting it in to these different accounts. Okay, so my approach here will be to start not from the notion of publicity, the property of being public itself, but rather from an attitude that I think we've got a very good grip on from thinking about deliberation. So deliberation in general involves repeatedly answering questions like this. Suppose the world is like this, suppose I did this other thing, then under those two suppositions, what would the outcome be like? Deliberation is framed by propositions that we take for granted throughout, propositions that assume true under all these arbitrary suppositions. Now, often we consider in decision theory the asocial decision maker, and a lonely decision maker, the hunter in the forest, needs only take things for granted in the sense that they assume them true under arbitrary factual suppositions. The hunter might consider the scenario where a given leaf is poisonous and a scenario where it's not poisonous, but it's kind of suppositions about the world and what they do that are the relevant parameters that are being varied there. Now, of course, when we come to the social context, where our decisions and their consequences are influenced by what others might or would do, then there's an extra parameter that needs to be factored in. So when I'm deciding what to do, when the consequence will also depend on what you do, then I might consider the world from your perspective to figure out what you're likely to do. Okay, so there's the factual supposition about what the world is like independently of us. There's the supposition about the action that I'm contemplating taking, but there's also the supposition that I'm in your shoes and figuring out how the whole scenario looks like from that other person's point of view. And if something is going to be taken for granted throughout all these suppositions, including the perspectival shifts here, then that's a very strong status. It's a stronger status than just taking it for granted through the factual and kind of action suppositions. So I'm thinking there's this notion treating something as public among the group, which is to be identified with the property of taking it for granted in deliberation in a social context involving those group members. Okay, now I've got these two notions, two graded notions of taking for granted the weak and the strong sense. In the weak sense, the one that's active in the asocial case, one takes for granted a proposition, I think, just in case one believes it. One believes it, then we'll keep it fixed when we kind of consider what happens if the belief was poisonous or whatever. But in this paper, I'm going to argue for a particular answer to the second question, the analog of this for the strong sense of taking for granted. That is, taking for granted where we hold it fixed, not just under factual suppositions, but also under the perspective shifts. Now, clearly, belief isn't going to do that job, because if I think that you don't believe something that I believe, then I'm not going to hold that fixed when I simulate your reasoning. So something more than belief needs to go on. And I'm going to say that one takes P for granted in the social sense with respect to a group, just in case you believe the proposition in question has some property, and that property will be approximately that the proposition is true and commonly believed. From this, I'll be able to extract a characterization of publicity, a characterization that will take a familiar shape. Okay, so the strategy here is to take this notion of treating as public, treat it as a kind of working primitive, but lay down various principles that are true of it and a priori true of it, and see what follows. On this slide, I've given you 3 a priori true principles. 2 of them should be relatively uncontroversial. The third one is where the action is, the treats correctness one. So just to run through the less controversial first 2, the first is belief entailment, and this is to say that if you treat something as public, then you believe it. That's really well motivated by what I've said so far, because if I take it for granted, a proposition for granted in the strong sense, under arbitrary, including perspective shifting suppositions, then as a special case, I'll take it for granted in the weak sense under only the factual suppositions. And I said that taking for granted in the weak sense was belief. So if something's treated as public, then as a special case, you believe it. And that should sound plausible anyway, but it's kind of enforced by the picture here. The second principle should seem even more platitudinous. A belief is correct, just in case its content is the case. No more needs to be said about that, I think. Okay, the third one is where the action is. So this does something like the belief correctness condition, but for the other attitude, treating as public. So what I'm saying here is that in order for you to be correct in treating a proposition as public, everybody else involved has to also treat the same proposition as public. There has to be a kind of mirroring going on. Let me say something about why that seems enforced. So suppose I treated something as public, like that the cat was on the mat, but you didn't. Okay, then there'll be some suppositions that you might engage in where, because you're not treating the cat on the mat as fixed, you know, you're considering cat being elsewhere possibilities. And one thing that I'm doing when I'm simulating you is simulating you simulating someone else. And so when I simulate you simulating someone else, and in the process of doing so, considering cat not being on the cat mat possibilities, as you in fact are, if I'm treating it as fixed throughout all these suppositions that the cat is on the mat, then I'm going to simulate you wrong. I'm not going to do it right. You're going to be considering possibilities that my simulation of you just doesn't contemplate. So that looks like a way of being incorrect. And so that's an argument that for me to treat a proposition as public, for that to be correct, then you have to treat it as public too. Okay. So those are the three main premises. The other crucial move I introduce on this slide, and this is maybe best seen as the theoretical conjecture that although treating a proposition as public is not to believe that proposition, it is a belief with some content or other. So if we identify treating a proposition as public with a belief with a certain content Q, presumably that content will involve P, but it also involves something else because we weren't identifying it with the belief that P. And so we'll just introduce the operator, it is public that, as filling in whatever the rest of the context is for this belief, which mirrors treating P as public. Now, if these are one and the same attitudes, treating as public and believing it is public that P, then they'd be instantiated in all the same cases. That's just a kind of Leibniz law kind of argument. But equally, they're the same attitude. They'll be correct in the same conditions. And that's what correctness equivalence gives us. So X treats P as public if and only if X believes that it's public that P. Our hypothesis enforces that. But also this kind of hypothesis enforces us saying that someone's going to be correct in treating P as public if and only if they're correct in believing that it's public that P. And this is really, I'm thinking of this as a way of implicitly defining the notion it is public that P in terms of its role within beliefs that express this strong taking for granted practical attitude. Okay, we've got everything on the table we need so far. So we now move to extracting some results. The main lemma is this thing that I here call public in all caps. And this claims that it's a consequence, an entailment of it being public that P, that everyone treats that proposition as public. So let me just briefly run through the argument for that. By belief correctness from a previous slide, it's public that P, just in case the belief that it's public that P is correct. But we know an equivalent to the right-hand side of this by the correctness equivalence. Okay, the belief that it is public that P is correct, just in case it's correct to treat P as public. Okay, so we substitute that in. But then we're now dealing with the right-hand side of line 2. It's correct to treat P as public. We know necessary condition for that to hold, which is that everyone treats P as public. That's what treats correctness gave us. And so just chaining those all together, we get the principle that I called public at the beginning of the slide. Public the P only if everyone treats P as public. Great. Okay, so that's definitely following by logic from what we've seen before. And from this we get two corollaries. Okay. Really all the work is done with public. Once you've got that, you look at the consequence of that conditional we've got there. Everyone treats P as public. From the instantiation equivalence, well, anyone who treats P as public has got to believe that it's public that P. That's the instantiation equivalence. We just substitute that in and we get the principle that I call introspection there. And again, if everyone's treating P as public, that's the consequent of the first conditional. We know by belief entailment that if that's happening, then everyone's got to be believing that P. So that gives us public belief entailment. So overall, we've got these two principles: introspection, public belief entailment. I'll just run through them again on the next slide, because this is pretty much everything we need to get the main results. So I set out 5 premises and claimed they were a priori. We ran through some reasoning, just logic, so also a priori. And so what we get overall is these 2 principles where I'm going to make the a prioricity explicit. The first one is a priori public belief entailment. It's a priori that it is public that P, only if everyone believes that P. And the second one is a priori introspection. It's a priori that it's public that P, only if everyone believes that it's public that P. Okay, that's quite a lot of information about what publicity must be like if it's implicitly defined in the way that I gave you on an earlier slide. And we can now see we can extract from that a really strong and informative identification of the consequences of publicity. So we need just one more notion in order to get this to work. I need a notion of commitment to belief. Okay, so very roughly, there are lots of things that I don't currently believe because I haven't thought of them, but my beliefs that they stand commit me to them. Okay, so like lots of logical consequences of my current views, mathematical theorems that follow from axioms I accept, and so on and so forth. A person is committed to believe something if and only if P is a priori entailed by something the person believes. It's quite a weak notion of commitment to belief there. From that notion, plus the 2 principles of the last slide, we get a really strong result. We get that it's public that P, that property of being public that P a priori entails that everyone believes that P, that everyone is committed to believe that everyone believes the P, that everyone's committed to believe that everyone is committed to believe that everyone believes P, and so on forever. This is common commitment to believe, which patterns very similarly to common knowledge or common belief that you might find in the literature, common reason to believe that you find in David Lewis, for example. The result that I'm claiming here is of a kind that's well known in the literature. Once you've got the introspection and belief entailment principles, then effectively what you do is you say, well, look at line 1 of common commitment to believe. That follows just by belief entailment, but it's a priori that follows from publicity. And so if somebody believes that the thing is public, then they'll be committed to believing line 1. But introspection tells us that everybody involved does believe that it's public, so they are committed to line 1, but that's what line 2 tells us. But all that reasoning was a priori. So that was an a priori consequence of something that everybody believes. So everybody's committed to believe that as well. And that's what line 3 tells us. And that iterated structure just goes on and on and on. Okay. So to sum up, the property of publicity is implicitly defined by its role in beliefs that express this practical attitude of treating something as public. From these connections and 3 independently compelling premises, we get 2 a priori constraints on publicity, number 1, number 2. A crucial thing here is that the way we defined commitment to believe, it was closed under a priori consequence. And if you put that together with the 2 principles that we have the result that publicity entails common commitment to believe. And in doing all this, I started with no assumptions about publicity, only about the practical attitude that beliefs about it express. So it's a kind of expressivist route into getting an analysis of publicity. Now, one thing that I want to emphasize at this point is at the moment I've only got a necessary condition on publicity, some consequences of what publicity is. In the full version of this talk, I'd also go on to explore what would be sufficient for it. And I think you can get a plausible argument that there's kind of an upper bound in terms of common belief for this as well. But the idea that publicity requires something like common belief, this common commitment belief notion. That, I think, is the central controversial direction. And so that's the thing. I think I'm giving you the kind of most interesting core of the longer paper.